Apologetics is where we give a case that Christianity is objectively true, compellingly rational, and pertinent to the whole of life.
Hey guys, I'm Bill Westers, and this is the Encountering Truth podcast. Welcome to the Encountering Truth podcast, where we examine the evidence for Christianity, engage culture with kindness and conviction, and encounter Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life. Well, I have a very special guest with me. My friend Dr. Doug Groothuis has joined me live in person, in studio, and by studio, I mean my living room. But Doug has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Oregon. He served as the a professor of philosophy at Denver Seminary, where he headed the Christian apologetics master's program, and has started his new position at Cornerstone University as Distinguished University Professor of Apologetics and Christian Worldview. Doug is the author of 20 books, including Unmasking the New Age, Christian Apologetics, Fire in the Streets, and his most recent book, Beyond the Wager, The Christian Brilliance of Blaise Pascal. He's also a regular contributor to the Worldview Bulletin and host of the Truth Tribe podcast. So thank you, Doug, for joining me. It's an honor to have you on the podcast and be able to welcome you into my home.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Well, that was a lot of things to share about you. Is there anything I missed? And can you give us a little bit of a background about yourself and how you got into apologetics and philosophy?
Yes. Well, I converted when I was 19 years old after my first year in college. And the first summer of being a Christian was really tough because I really didn't know how to think as a Christian. I knew that Jesus was the way, but I had not developed any sense of a Christian worldview or apologetics. And then in the fall of 76, I went back to college, this time at the University of Oregon, Eugene, Oregon, and I was in the university bookstore, and I saw this book called The God Who Was There by Francis Schaeffer. And I had heard a little bit about Schaeffer, but I had not read him yet. So I bought that book and read it, and that ignited this great intellectual, apologetic, philosophical adventure I've been on for the last, 48 years.
Wow.
He really convinced me not only that Christianity was true, but that it was rational, and also that we could enter into the world of ideas and culture without fear. And we had something that the world desperately needed, and without Christ there is ultimately no hope and no meaning.
Right.
So I went on to read as many of his books as I could. I started reading C.S. Lewis, Os Guinness, James Sire, people like that, St. Augustine.
Right.
About a year later, Blaise Pascal, who's been a tremendous influence on me. So that eventually led me to get a degree in philosophy in undergrad. I did campus ministry for 5 years, University of Oregon, then eventually got a master's degree and PhD, and I was professor of philosophy at Denver Seminary for 31 years.
Wow.
And we just moved here 2 months ago. We live in Lowell, Michigan. It's about 20 minutes from where I am right now. Where am I right now?
Rockford. Michigan.
Yeah, right. Where am I? What's going on? That's what I thought, right? So my real passion in life is to make the reality of God known. Christianity is a knowledge tradition. We're not simply issuing ideas in the dark. We have reasons to believe what we believe. And that's what I've been attempting to do all these years through my teaching, preaching, writing, mentoring. I try to take the Christian message out into the public world as much as possible. We need to build up the church and Christian schools, seminaries, but we also need to mix it up in whatever venue we can find. So I always enjoy speaking in mixed settings, like speaking on campus to a Christian group or getting an editorial published in a newspaper. I'm an old guy, so I used to think in terms of newspapers. They're not too powerful anymore. Some still are. So that's really my heartbeat, is to make the truth known as broadly as I can and give the best arguments I can and not waste any time.
Yeah, that's good. And that's The podcast is called Encountering Truth, and truth is important. So I'd love to get your definition of apologetics and why is it so important?
Right. There are a number of good ways to define apologetics. The way I define it is to say that apologetics is where we give a case that Christianity is objectively true, compellingly rational, and pertinent to the whole of life. I love Pascal's statement. He says that we should make people wish Christianity were true and then show that it is. So we want to make it appealing, not by changing it to suit modern tastes. That's wrong, that's sinful, that's worldly. But we're offering eternal life, the forgiveness of sin, a meaningful life, a worldview that makes sense of things. That should be appealing to us. Of course, there's always the offense of the cross, and God opposes the proud and exalts the humble. So you have to humble yourself under the mighty hand of God to come into the Christian faith. But once you realize that you're a creature, you're a sinner, you need a Savior, then the Bible provides such beautiful, robust knowledge into reality, and it guides our entire life. So we emphasize the objective. Christianity is true to facts. It speaks truth about reality. And it also gives us a very compelling way to live. So you've got the objective and the existential combined, hand in glove.
Yeah, that's good. Now, there are some people that might think, oh, well, why worry about evidence and why spend your time on that and not just, in prayer and reading your Bible or having a blind faith? What would you say to those type of people?
Well, when you go to the Bible itself, it tells us to defend the faith. 1 Peter 3:15 says we should have a reason for the hope that is within us that we can present with gentleness and respect. Jude tells us to contend earnestly for the faith given once for all to the saints. Jesus defended what he believed through arguments. The Apostle Paul did, the Apostle Peter did. So apologetics is part of the mission of the church, period. It's an imperative that rests on the church. Now, some people are more gifted at it than others. Some people have a lot of time to read and write and teach the way I do. But we're all to have a reason for the hope that is within us. That's part of our Christian testimony. However, God calls us, we need to know what the gospel is. We need to have a story of why we are Christians. And then we need to be listening to the kind of objections and questions that appear in our culture. And some of those are perennial. Some of them are more time-bound. So a great perennial question would be, is there a God? Another one would be, why is there evil in the world? Another one would be, who are we as human beings?
Right.
And then we have topics that come up from time to time, and I've addressed those in my writing, like the New Age movement, postmodernism, more recently critical race theory. And the Christian worldview has answers to those challenges I've found through my writing. So I have been so intellectually and existentially satisfied and gratified as a Christian. I'm kind of in the final stretch here. I think I'm pretty healthy, but I'm 67, and you think differently when you're 67 than when you were 57, 47.
Right.
And I look back on my life and I think I've had a lot of struggles. My first wife died of dementia. It was horrible. I have not been the exemplary Christian in every way in my life. I've sinned and repented. But overall, when I look at my life, I think I am on the right side because of God's grace. It's not because I was so intelligent or I was good, by no means. Through the works of the law shall no one be justified, but the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Yeah. And I was lost, and we're all lost. And by the grace of God, we can be found. So when we find Christ, by his grace, we don't just find a new religious perspective. We find a whole new worldview, a new way to live, a way to rejoice, a way to suffer, an approach to the intellectual life, an approach to the emotional life, the imagination. Christianity is this broad, robust, capacious worldview and way of living. And so I've been trying to write that out and teach about that and preach that and evangelize regarding that all these years. So I want to keep doing that as wisely and strongly as I possibly can.
Yeah. Yeah, I was actually having a conversation with some people the other day, and we were talking about, you were saying how, we all sin, and so we were having a conversation about, hypocrites in the church. People, get worked up about the idea of people not living up to their faith, and we were discussing the idea of that's really actually part of the Christian worldview.
Exactly.
Is that we are all hypocrites in some way. We cannot live up, and that's why we need a savior. And in fact, your title at Cornerstone is the professor of apologetics and Christian worldview. Can you tell us, explain how does that apologetics play into and relate to a Christian worldview?
People may be hearing my dog panting in the background, which is great. He likes to do interviews too. But back to hypocrisy for a minute. You're right. Jesus warned about hypocrisy. And, a hypocrite is not somebody who doesn't live up to their ethics. A hypocrite is somebody who doesn't live up to their ethics and pretends they do.
Right.
So if we sin, we don't live up to what we know is good and true, then we can repent. And God is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. But you're right, Christianity in the Bible predicts that people will fall short. Some are wolves in sheep's clothing. They're completely off. And other people are just struggling, stumbling along. And they're truly following Christ. So when people say, well, I don't go to church because it's full of hypocrites, you say, well, it's not. Yeah, sure, there are some. But everybody is trying to find their way if they're sincere Christians. The smug kind of line is, the church is full of hypocrites, why don't you join and we'll have one more, right? It's just kind of a smart aleck answer, right? But worldview and apologetics. Apologetics defends the Christian worldview. That's how they fit together. And a worldview is a set of assumptions about the basic makeup of the world. It has to do, if you want to use the categories of philosophy, with metaphysics, what is, epistemology, how we know, morality. There are a lot of ways of explaining what a worldview is. You can use the basic categories of philosophy. You can use the meta-narrative approach, which is creation, fall, redemption, consummation. That's the story approach, but then you always have propositions contained in the story. So you can ask, what is the ultimate reality? What is the human condition? How should we live? What is the good life? Is there an afterlife? What is the basis of ethics? Those are worldview questions. And every worldview, whether it's Christianity or Buddhism or Islam or atheism, needs to answer those questions. So it's helpful to get a sense of what Christianity is in terms of this big idea of worldview. Now, recently, it kind of surprised me in the last 5 years, some people started attacking the idea of worldview, even Christians. So in my second edition of Christian Apologetics, I had a little defense of worldview thinking. And I said, well, it's not the same as a systematic theology. We're not saying your worldview replaces attending church. It's just a way of framing the basic Christian message philosophically and then offering it up into the world of ideas and say, here's my worldview. Here's the basic Christian worldview. Now here's a Buddhist worldview, an atheist worldview. Which worldview, to put it simply, best explains reality?
Right.
That's the ultimate issue.
Yeah, I like that. And let's talk about some of the arguments. Maybe switch gears a little bit and talking about some of the arguments for God, the existence of God. We've talked about the cosmological, the moral argument, the design argument. First of all, do you have a particular favorite or one that you might think is strongest?
I like all of the arguments. I mean, you can formulate
Yeah.
all the arguments to be very compelling, I think. So we have the cosmological argument, which says that if we have a universe, where did it come from? The best explanation, there was a first cause of the universe. We have a design argument that looks at the nature of what is there, patterns, regularities, and we say that God as a creating mind is the best explanation of that. The moral argument, if there is objective morality, where does it come from? We say that God as the lawgiver is the best explanation for that. And there's also an argument called the ontological argument, which is a lot more abstract and somewhat complex, but if you do the work, I think it's very powerful. And the conclusion of that is that there is a maximal being. There's a being who possesses every attribute that it's better to possess than lack, and possesses it completely. St. Anselm was the first to formulate that. More recently, people like Alvin Plantinga, William Lane Craig. And then we've got religious experience arguments. I did an interview with Lee Strobel for his most recent book on the religious experience arguments. The book is called Is God Real? And I recommend it. So that argument is that some people over history have had experiences that are best explained as having a divine origin, not merely a human psychological origin or a social science explanation. And there are more than that. So in my book, Christian Apologetics, I think I've got about 250 pages worth of arguments for God's existence. And I also even have a chapter defending that this is a good idea. When you do apologetics, you have to kind of clear the underbrush a little bit because some people say, no, don't do apologetics, just believe and pray.
Right.
And that's a bunch of rationalism and Christians shouldn't do that. And then other people say, well, the idea of a worldview gets you off track. No. And there's some people that say that doing natural theology is mistaken for some reason or another. And I think I've dealt with all the objections to that. Let me just give you one. Well, the Bible itself doesn't have a cosmological argument or design argument.
Sure.
So why should we do it if it's not there in the Bible? Two responses to that. My hero, Blaise Pascal, gave this argument. Even he was wrong sometimes. Just because the Bible doesn't give an example of something doesn't mean it disallows it or forbids it. And in the Bible, in the biblical times, atheism was not really so much of the problem. It was more polytheism or maybe pantheism. But when Paul addresses the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers, he engages in some philosophical reasoning with them. So I think there's philosophical reasoning for the existence of God in Scripture. In Acts 17, there's sort of a framework or a sketch of an argument in Romans 1, 18 through 21. But simply because we don't have developed natural theology in the Bible, it doesn't mean it's somehow illegitimate, right? It's not there. Why isn't it there? Because I don't think it was needed, really, at the time. The question is really, can we construct significant arguments, meaning sound and valid arguments for the existence of a creator, designer, lawgiver? And I think the answer is we can. It could be that it would be legitimate to try to do natural theology. Nothing in the Bible stops it, but none of the arguments work very well. That's possible.
Right.
I don't hold that. Otherwise, I wouldn't have written 250 pages in my apologetics book. And also, that would mean people like William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland are wrong in their arguments for God's existence, and they're not. They give powerful arguments.
Yeah. I want to go back. We've talked on this podcast about what are kind of those main three: the cosmological, design, and moral. I haven't gone into the ontological argument. You mentioned it and kind of briefly laid it out. Can you kind of unpack that a little bit more in as simple as terms as we can to get an understanding of that?
It's very hard to simplify.
Right.
So by way of contrast, think of the Kalam cosmological argument. In a way, it's pretty simple. Anything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe had a cause. And that cause would have to be timeless, spaceless, vastly powerful, and so on. So you've got two premises, a conclusion, and then you exegete the metaphysics of a conclusion. What would be needed to create a universe? Now, it can be very complicated because you've got to deal with the idea of potential infinite, actual infinite, even get into some mathematical theories about numbers. And that can be done. And I have a version of a cosmological argument in my book. But the ontological argument, for one thing, is not a empirical argument. It's a rational or rationalist argument, which means you don't look at the universe and say, what's the best explanation for it? You consider the idea of God, the rational conception of God. And Anselm said, God is a being than which greater cannot be conceived. And what he means by that is God is a perfect being or a maximal being.
Right.
And let's consider the idea of a maximal being would be perfectly good, completely powerful, all-knowing, all the attributes of a God of the Bible. Now, there are different versions of the argument, but let me give you one that Alvin Plantinga has developed, and that is he uses modal logic, and he says, let's take the idea of a perfect being, an absolute perfect being. Now, is it possible that that kind of being could exist? Well, it is, unless the idea of an absolute being has some kind of a contradiction within it. So, of course, it's possible that unicorns exist, but we don't have any evidence that they do. We have no reason to think they do. But the idea of a maximal being is very different than any less than maximal being, any contingent being, any finite being. So Plantinga says, if it's possible that a maximal being exists, then that being exists in one possible world. And a possible world is a state of affairs that could obtain, could be the case. Okay. Now, let's go back to the unicorn. Does a unicorn exist in a possible world? Yes, we can think of a world where there are unicorns. We can think of maybe even this one. I'm looking at your beautiful open space here. Maybe I see a unicorn sighting. It's possible, right?
Yeah.
But a unicorn doesn't exist in every possible world.
Okay.
Now, if God exists in any possible world, that is, the idea of a maximal being is logically possible, then God would have to exist in every one.
To be maximal.
Yeah. So if 2 + 2 is 4 in any world, it's true in every world. If a triangle has 3 sides, it's true in any world, it's true in every world. That's sort of the short version of that. Anselm had 2 versions. Norman Malcolm has another version. I deal with all those in my book, Christian Apologetics. But it's not the kind of argument that is easy to summarize, nor is it as intuitively obvious maybe as design arguments, cosmological arguments. But if you put in the work, I think it is convincing. And it's also very powerful because you get all the
call
attributes.
It the king of the hill.
It is. It's like the king of the hill of the arguments because a good cosmological argument will tell you that God is all-powerful and is the causal originator of the universe. But it doesn't, and it will tell you some other things about God, that God is a personal being. It doesn't speak to God's goodness, for example. And the design argument speaks to God as the mind behind the cosmos and vastly intelligent. But again, it doesn't tell you certain things about God, like God's goodness or something like that. Now, the ontological argument, if it works, tells you that God is a maximal being, meaning he possesses every attribute that's good to have and possesses it to the nth degree.
Right.
So you get everything with that argument. And I think there's also a way to build in the Trinity to that argument, because the idea of a Trinity is really the best explanation for the reality of love.
Right.
So if God is one being in 3 persons, love has always existed, and we value love as a wonderful, beautiful thing. So the idea of God as a Trinity is actually a higher idea in terms of value than just God being only unitary, like Islam teaches. So I do that in my chapter. I say that we can make this ontological argument and then also build the Trinity into it. That would be the ultimate being, the maximal being, because you don't just have all good, all powerful, everywhere present, but you have an ontological support for the idea of love. And one of my students wrote a book explaining love on the basis of Christianity, named Jonah Haddad. It's really a marvelous book called Leaving Dirt Place. It's an odd title. It has to do with a dream that he had, but the book is like a search for the meaning of love and the explanation of love. And he very thoroughly goes through the options of atheism, pantheism, monotheism without the Trinity, and concludes that if love is objectively real, which he makes the case that it is, then the best explanation for the reality of love is God.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a nice way to combine those arguments too. That argument is not really an ontological argument. It's more of a best explanation argument. But you find that these arguments often dovetail,
kind of
and
overlap,
collaborate.
and, yeah.
They're not at each other's throats.
Right.
They're pursuing a common end, and that is God exists, and we should recognize that and worship him and serve him.
That's good. I was watching, there's a video, I don't know if you've seen before, where switching over to like the cosmological argument, Stephen C. Meyer was being interviewed by Piers Morgan, I think. And he lays out a lot of that cosmological argument, and I found it interesting. It's fascinating, actually. But then I've also heard pushback about it. Oh, well, that's just philosophical. There's no empirical evidence about that. What would you say to someone that made some sort of argument like that?
Well, you can make a purely philosophical argument for the existence of God by saying that it's impossible to traverse an actual infinite. And William Lane Craig has made that argument. J.P. Moreland has made that argument. And the idea is that if the universe is past eternal, we would never get to the present because you can't make progress with an infinite past.
Right.
The way Bill Craig puts it is you can't jump out of a bottomless pit.
Yeah.
So if the universe is past eternal, there'd be what's called an actual infinite of moments, and you cannot traverse or cross an actual infinite of moments. You'd never get to now.
Right.
Well, we did get to now.
Yeah.
So there had to have been a first moment. Now that's a purely philosophical argument based on the idea of the impossibility of traversing an actual infinite. Has nothing to do with physics. And it's a little technical, but not forbiddingly so, I don't think. But you could just not worry about that and say, let's look at the best evidence from physics and astronomy, and it's that the universe began to exist a finite time ago. It's in common parlance called the Big Bang cosmology. It's typically called the Standard Model.
Okay.
And in Steve Meyer's latest book, Return of the God Hypothesis, he brings us completely up to date on where that theory stands, and it is still the king of the hill. Nobody's come close to overturning it. There have been some revisions of it, but it still concludes that the universe began to exist out of nothing a finite time ago. That is the best explanation for several lines of converging evidence that has developed over the last about 60 years. So the Big Bang cosmology, which delivers creation ex nihilo, is very well established in the scientific world. And it's interesting that as this was unfolding, some of the physicists who were atheists did not like it. They knew where this was going.
Right.
And years ago, 1979, Robert Jastrow, who was an agnostic astronomer, wrote a book chronicling this. And he points out, and I mentioned this in my apologetics book as well, it's called God and the Astronomers, that some of these people like Einstein and others didn't like this idea.
Right.
But whether you like the evidence and where the evidence points or not is irrelevant, right? But you could see why they didn't, because they were naturalists. They were atheists. Well, Einstein was kind of a pantheist, but none of them wanted to believe in a personal God who created the world. They thought that was somehow unscientific, which it isn't. But the point here is that the empirical evidence from physics, astrophysics, is the temporal finitude of the universe, and that the universe came into being out of nothing a finite time ago. Then you have to say, well, how do we explain that?
Right.
And amazingly, some atheists say, well, stuff happens. Universes pop into being out of nothing. What do you know? That is so irrational because scientists don't have that kind of a theory in any other sphere of life.
Right.
They look for explanations for events. Now, in this case, the explanation has to be non-natural. It has to be extra universe, right? It has to be supernatural. So they might say, well, we can't go in that direction. Why not? You just have this principle. Anything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence. The universe began to exist. Obviously, the universe cannot cause itself. Nothing can cause itself. Nothing can create itself. Stephen Hawking to the contrary. So what's the best explanation? A timeless, spaceless, immaterial, vastly powerful being who decided to create it. That's just the inference. It's not like we go into a religious trance now. We were doing good science. We go into a religious trance and say God did it. It is a rational inference based on evidence and solid principles of reasoning.
Yeah, people will say though that, oh, isn't that just a God of the gaps theory, argument where it's like, well, we don't know what caused it, so it must have been God. What do you say to that?
Yeah, that's a common objection, and there's quite a bit we could say about that, but the explanation I just gave is a rational explanation based on empirical evidence and a very credible principle of causation. So if God happens to be the conclusion of that, what's wrong with that? Why not allow an intelligent, creative, transcendent being to explain aspects of reality? To exclude that, in principle, is a fallacy called begging the question. And it's also assuming something called methodological naturalism, which says science only gives natural explanations for natural events. So basically, what my net don't catch ain't fish, right? So the net of science only appeals to the natural world to explain anything. Well, the natural world cannot explain the existence of the natural world or the design of the natural world. So why bring about this kind of epistemological veto and say no supernatural explanation? Many years ago, I gave a talk at a secular university, Metro State University, and it was called The Deniable Darwin. And I was giving one objection to Darwinism based on the bacterial flagellum, a molecular machine in the cell. And after the talk was over, this fellow came up and said, "You're just giving God of the gaps, God of the gaps." And I said, no, an intelligent designer is a better explanation for the irreducible complexity of the bacterial flagellum than a undirected series of events. It's an explanation. It's a pattern of explanation we use all the time in other areas of life, like criminology and breaking codes, cryptography. The design inference is used all over the place. Bill Dembski's done the best work on this, William Dembski. And I said this, I said it's not an appeal to ignorance, it's an appeal to our knowledge of the world and how we explain things. And this guy just kept saying, it's God of the gaps, God of the gaps, and he just kept raising the volume. It's called the decibel theory of persuasion. You're not making any good points, so you just raise the volume, right? So this gentleman absorbed this guy for me. He started talking to him. And this guy just kept arguing with this guy for about an hour. Oh, wow. And I was free to engage the students who were there who really wanted to discuss things. So the God of the gaps is just a bogeyman. You could give irresponsible explanations by invoking God as a primary cause for things that naturally occur. That could be done. But the intelligent design movement never does that.
Right.
And moreover, the basic regularities of the universe are best explained by an orderly God that put us in the world to know something about it and to develop science. Again, Steve Meyer's book, Return of the God Hypothesis, has a chapter called The Rise of Theistic Science. And the greatest scientists in the scientific revolution, people like Newton and Kepler and others, were motivated to study the world and discover natural laws because they believed that God was a rational God who created an orderly universe and put us here to discover the world. And the world also is made up of contingent events and contingent processes. So we don't just sit back in our chair and think, well, what would the orbits of the planets be like? Well, they'd have to be perfectly circular. Well, of course. No, you have to actually go out there and investigate and formulate theories and test the theories. And the Christian worldview is right at the foundation for the development of modern science. So when secular scientists come along and say, we don't need religion, God, we simply do the science, God is a knowledge stopper, is something Richard Dawkins has said, they don't understand the history of science. And they're also parasitic. There's this great clip with William Lane Craig interviewing or doing a debate on Firing Line back in 1998. It was hosted by Bill Buckley and this, I'll think of the guy's name, I hope, in a minute, but this atheist scientist, Peter Atkins, says, science is omnipotent. You simply want to believe in God, and there's just no place for God. It's all about science. And Bill Craig ticks off 5 things that we know in order to engage in science that science itself or the empirical evidence doesn't tell us. Things like the truths of mathematics map onto reality. You don't derive that from science. You assume that, and then you'd have to explain it. Naturalism doesn't explain that. Values you need for scientific discovery: be honest with the evidence, share the evidence with others. You can't derive that from any experiment or scientific theory. Now, that's nothing against science. It's simply saying science has its lane, but there are other values of knowledge, in fact, that are necessary for fruitful scientific endeavor. And if nobody has seen this, you have to go on YouTube, put on William Lane Craig, Peter Atkins, Firing Line, and watch. This is the ultimate intellectual takedown, because Peter Atkins is an arrogant ignoramus, and Bill Craig is so winsome. He says, well, no, actually, just goes like 1, 2, 3. And at the end of Atkins, just his eyes start becoming twice as big as normal. And William F. Buckley, in his inimitable way, says, I'll put that in your pipe and smoke it. It's just classic, but it shows that scientism, science is the only avenue for knowledge, is false.
Right.
Plus, we've got all this positive evidence based on chemistry, biology, and physics for the objective existence of God as the explanation of the universe.
Yeah, well, that's really good. I've seen that, and it's hilarious when you just look at his face. He's just like a deer in the headlights. Like, what just hit me? I don't even.
Yeah, a deer in the headlights looks knowledgeable compared to Atkins' expressions. And what I love about this takedown is that it's funny in a way, but it's also on target intellectually. And Bill Craig is not gloating. He's not arrogant. He's just saying, no, 1, 2, 3, 4, and there's no response to this.
Right. Yeah, that's
Whenever you get depressed in apologetics, just go look at that clip, and it will charge you up for a week.
Yeah. Well, this has been great, but I want to take it a little bit different direction. So traditionally, we've been talking about evidence for God, and a lot of times we think of apologetics as that, making a case, a defense for a reason for the hope that you have, and making case for Christianity based on 1 Peter 3:15, right? But that also carries over a lot into social and cultural issues, whether that's things like abortion or same-sex marriage, transgenderism, critical race theory. How would you articulate maybe the link or the connection between those traditional apologetics and these social issues? Right.
Well, on the one hand, you defend the Christian message as objectively true, compelling, and rational, but then pertinent to the whole of life. So pertinent to the whole of life has to do with personal meaning, how we comport ourselves, what is a family, what is a human being, what should I hope, how should I live. But it also deals with collective realities like what is a good society, what is a good political policy. And Christianity bears on those issues as well, and there are philosophies that come up, like postmodernism and critical race theory, that indirectly or directly attack the legitimacy of Christianity. So we need to use a phrase from Alvin Plantinga, defeat the defeater. So someone says, well, Christianity is inherently racist. We need to rebut that. We need to defeat that defeater. Or if someone says, well, you Christians claim Christianity is objectively true. There's no such thing as objective truth. It's all narrative and constructions and deconstructions. Well, we have to address that as well. And then also constructively as Christians, we want to think about society and about intellectual issues from a very rich, well-informed Christian worldview. So if I can present a biblical view of psychology based on the fact that we're made in God's image, but we're fallen and we can be redeemed, that's a counter to any kind of secular view of psychology. And the same goes for any discipline.
Right. All right. Well, this has been a great conversation, and we're going to do another episode specifically talking about the critical race theory, because you actually address that in your book, Fire in the Streets, how you can confidently respond to incendiary cultural topics. Maybe as we close, though, maybe you can give it just a brief teaser about the idea behind that book and why the audience should tune in and listen to that next episode when it comes out.
Yeah. Well, maybe the teaser needs to be a trigger warning too, because I'm not at all politically correct, and I may offend people. But I wrote my book "Fire in the Streets" because there was fire in the streets in 2020 with the George Floyd riots, and people kept asking me, "What's going on? What's the philosophy behind this?" And I knew from my study of Marxism, neo-Marxism, and so on. So I wanted to explain what was fueling these ideas that America is systemically racist, that we suffer from white privilege, that this whole civil rights vision was wrong, it really didn't help people, that we need to give up on America, the American ideal. It's over, it's been destroyed. So when I heard people saying things like this in the summer of 2020, and people kept asking me, what is at the root of this? Where did this come from? And I basically knew. So I decided to write a critique of critical race theory and then also give a Christian response to these questions of race, economics, politics, from a Christian worldview that was also politically conservative, because I think that is the view that makes the most sense of who we are biblically and also in terms of history and how economics works and so on. So I dedicated my book to Thomas Sowell, who's, I think, one of our greatest living economists and historians, and has explained so much for so long, for so many years. And I sent a copy of the book to him at the Hoover Institution, and I was really hoping I'd get a card back. Darn. But I'm still so appreciative of his work, because I'm a Christian. I don't believe that he is, but he's done extremely good work on the history of race in the United States, how economics works, and all those kinds of things. So that's why I wrote the book.
Okay, yeah. All right, well, share with us where our listeners can find you, buy your books, follow you.
Yes, well, I have a webpage with a very exciting title called douglasgroothuis.com. I also have a podcast called Truth Tribe, which is put out by Life Audio. That's very easy to find. That's free. And my books are all available on Amazon, at least the ones that are in print. And even, actually, if they're not in print, you can usually still get them on Amazon. Okay. You know, some people say available wherever books are sold. Not really.
Right.
I go into Barnes & Noble, and darn it, they don't have any of my books on the shelves. But you can always order them from Barnes & Noble or some other store, and you can get them on Amazon. You can get them directly from the publisher. I published many books with InterVarsity Press. You can order from intervarsitypress.com.
Okay, well, great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Doug Groothuis, for joining us and offering such incredible wisdom. Make sure that you guys check him out. And if you're interested in some in-depth study of apologetics, there's probably not many books out there that can rival his nice, big, thick Christian apologetics book, A Comprehensive Case for Biblical Faith. And I'll put those links in the show notes. But thank you guys for listening to this episode. Remember to subscribe to the podcast, share it with your friends, give us a good rating wherever you listen, and don't forget to follow us on Facebook and visit the website, encounteringtruth.org. But remember, as always, let's make it our goal to examine the evidence, engage culture, and encounter Jesus. God bless. We'll see you next time.